You had a long and interesting career in forestry, and I think it would be worth starting with that because it leads to other things. To what extent do you think getting into forestry was part of your own family background and history? Did it play a role in your decision to go into that area?
Oh, I just learnt so much. It was like an apprenticeship, or it was an apprenticeship, and you learnt so much about so many different things that were interesting. And when we were first doing the forest, we shifted around to different areas all the time. So we were meeting different people, and some of the old foresters, they were wonderful fellows. They had great work ethics, and I think being with those people, I think, was of great benefit to me for my future life, and it set the tone of how I looked at life and worked.
One of your main jobs, if I've got it right, was as a ranger, and you were developing roads, making forests accessible. Do you think that had a bearing on later exploration? You were forging roads in other places?
I think it was all part of that. When I was in the forest department at that time, the policy was to open up as much as the forest as possible for better fire control and to see what timber was there. They were assessing and finding out what timber was there. So it was a pretty important time. There was a fair bit of money and quite a few people operating in forested areas. And I was lucky enough to be at a place between Nannup at that time, Nannup and Margaret River, and had the job of opening up a lot of that country by putting in new roads. The roads were basically forest tracks. They weren't formed in any big way or anything, but they were a means of getting into the country and seeing what was there.
This is a very broad question, but there has to be an ethic about every occupation in a way. Was there an ethic about forestry, how you were handling that particular situation? Because you have an environmental factor involved. What was the feeling about care?
Well, the forestry was a lot to do with opening country up so that it could be controlled, because in many of these areas previously there'd just been uncontrolled wildfires going through and they created immense damage. Some of the results were easy to see down the southwest, Walpole, Nornlup, where they had big fires in the 1930s, and for many years afterwards all the crowns were burnt off and a tremendous lot of damage. So the idea was to open it up and maybe control burn it, put fires through so that you didn't have these fierce fires and so that the fires could be easily contained.
Access.
Yes, access to forest areas to protect the forest.
That's an aspect of forestry that's, I think, not always appreciated, is it? That you sense that it's all woodland, but as you say, you had to find means of securing areas of forest from the risk you've mentioned about bushfires and uncontrollable fire.
Yes, the forest in the southwest down here has adapted to fire over many thousands of years and everything, and many of the plants don't generate or bloom without fire and smoke going through it. But if it's left for a long time and there's a build-up of vegetation, it's not like the old days when the Aboriginals used to continually burn it and it was fairly easy to walk through when you talk to the old people. But with the build-up and fierce fires, a lot of the forest would be destroyed, and this was a way of trying to prevent that.
You did lots of different jobs, didn't you? And I guess a question begs itself, why did you leave forestry? You had a very interesting life there and you've written about it very interestingly. Why did you feel you wanted to do something else?
It really started after I spent a whole summer working 7 days a week opening up roads between Nannup and Margaret River, and I'd built up a huge amount of accrued leave, which when winter set in, much to the consternation of those in the head office, when they found out, I had about a month or 6 weeks of leave due to me. And at that time I took it, and with a mate we travelled up through the northwest, up through the Pilbara and everything like that. And I was quite excited at seeing all this new country and new places and so on. And it was always nagged at me a little bit. I wanted to see more. So I decided that I was going to do a bit of travel, see more places. And that's what I did. We left. And
you're discovering diversity, weren't you? Because the Karijini and the Kimberley are a very different country from the southwest.
Entirely. So that was very exciting. And getting up there, it was hard to get around in those places in those days too, but just getting into the places.
You went to New Zealand too at one stage, didn't you?
Yes. I left the forest department and I travelled across to the eastern states with a couple of people I knew. One of them was Hugh Smith, a reporter on the old Daily News, and another bloke called Ben Mainstone, who had a second-hand car yard and garage here in Canning Highway. We travelled across there with lots of adventures to South Australia, and I decided to do itinerant work. I did have a job with the Forest Service in South Australia, but I decided that I would have a go at fruit picking. I liked it, and I could make more money by contract working, which we did. It was all contract. And at the end of the fruit picking season, I'd heard before and since about cane cutting in Queensland. So I decided to go to Queensland and try my hand at cane cutting. So I had an old push bike there. I rode from Renmark in South Australia to Dubbo in New South Wales. By that time I'd had the bike and it had had me, and I hitchhiked my way to Brisbane, caught a special train that took cane cutters up to North Queensland, and I ended up at a place called Bartle Frere near Babinda in Queensland, and I had 4 seasons of cane cutting up there. Good money, and I liked the work. It was a challenging work, and the harder you worked, the more you earned, which I liked. And during that time I met Yvonne again, who I'd gone to school with in Margaret River. I met her up in Cairns. We got together again, and we ended up coming back to West Australia. We got married in Margaret River, and then we went to New Zealand on a honeymoon. Didn't know what we were going to do, but anyway we decided we'd go over there for 6 months, and we ended up being over there for 7 years, so it was pretty exciting.
All these broadening experiences, did they lead you in a way to become involved in nature tourism?
I think it was all the build-up of knowledge and getting and seeing the places, and we always liked to show people things in the bush or do that sort of thing. And I think that later on this had quite an influence on our lifestyle at that time. I think had a big influence on what we did.
Back in the early days, you'd formed a bond with nature, hadn't you? Do you remember how that came about when you first were aware of the beauty of nature and your relationship to it?
From a very early age, because our house backed onto forest. It was a mixed Jarrah Marri forest at the back of us, and no house or anything through there. And the wildflowers and everything used to intrigue me. My mother was a great nature lover, so was my father, but my mother more than anything else. And she was very interested in ground orchids, terrestrial orchids and wildflowers. And we used to seek these things out. A lot of them didn't have names. We tried to find out names for them and so on. And we always had a love of the bush, of trees and the flowers that went through there and everything that inhabited in the bush. I mean, we used to sit for hours watching ants and other things doing their business and so on. So yeah, it was with us all our life from the start.
And when you met and married Yvonne, do you think you were pioneering nature tourism?
We did. There was no one doing nature tourism as such. It was all adventure tourism for those that were operating tour businesses, and there weren't many of those in those days. We actually bought a company that was involved in adventure tourism and nothing else. They knew nothing about nature or anything, but they used to do these trips across to Alice Springs and down south. And we started doing this because we liked the areas, we wanted to see the areas, we wanted to take people to the area. But we quickly found out that people were wanting to know more. They were wanting to know what there was, what was this plant, and where can I see this, and so on. We quickly realised that we should be concentrating on what we call nature-based tourism. At that time, ecotourism, the word hadn't been coined. That wasn't until the early 1980s. And we started out doing tours down south where the Fitzgerald Reserve is now. It wasn't a reserve in those days. It was just bush, and right through the south coast and right through. And we gradually concentrated just on this, and we eventually got clientele that would come to us. They used to come from all over the world to go with us to these places, and we developed interests with Wildflower Society. We used to take them on annual trips, Naturalist Club, Eastern States clubs, and plant-based clubs from England and all those places, they would come to us and we would take them. And we would always do a reconnaissance trip. Yvonne and I would always do a reconnaissance trip. If we had a special group come in, wanting to see different plants or a different area, we'd make sure that before they came, we would go out there, check the areas, check what was likely to be out. If there'd been a fire, sometimes a fire made a big difference. Sometimes it was regeneration, been really good, lots of wildflowers and so on. And we would check things out. So they got a quality experience and we knew what we were going to show them.
Taking on a new job like that, were you surprised at the success of it?
Quite honestly, for a few years, it wasn't very successful. As a matter of fact, it drained us of all our resources and finances for a few years, but gradually, once it became known, it became very successful and we ended up getting more equipment. We had some very good people helping us to drive and explain things, people that knew what they were talking about. By the time we were ready to sell out, amazingly, we had a year ahead of full bookings, which I don't know of any other company that has. And for the second year, we had bookings which people used to, Easter and other places, they would always have us booked for those ones. So, yeah, we were quite amazed.
I suppose as you did it, you learnt more and more how to do it better, I guess, did you?
Yes. Well, we used to specialise in birding tours, wildflower tours, natural history tours generally, right through, and with different areas and different groups wanting different things, we became very versatile, not too much.
What was the contribution of the original Australians to your work, the Aboriginal people who'd been here for a long time before we arrived?
Very little to start off with. We seldom had any contact with any of those sort of people for a long time. But later on we developed relationships with them where we visited, especially up in the Kimberley, started visiting some of their artworks and so on. And one particular trip that we did up to Camden Harbour in about 1990, we involved Aboriginals there to provide Aboriginal names to features and everything like that. We had a couple of people from geographical names and everything to record those on the trip and for them to tell us what the country was like.
Any useful lessons from those contacts? What did you become aware of in terms of their relationship to land and culture?
Well, if it was the older people in those times that had been brought up, and a lot of them had been brought up in the early days, say the Kimberley Coast, Kunmunya Mission or any of those places, and they still retained a lot of the knowledge, it was just invaluable of places and things. For example, I know one time when we were at Camden, we were walking up a creek, we were hoping to find water and it was very dry. And one of these Aboriginal fellows said, water's just up around the bend. And I said, how do you know that? He says, can't you smell them? We were quite amazed that they could smell water. They were equally well amazed that we couldn't. So there were lots of things that, were of benefit and useful.
The Lonely Graves Project, can you tell me about this?
Yvonne started this up, her interest in genealogy from an early age, and our tourism business were, I think, the start of all of this. We used to take people out, especially the other side of the goldfields, and we'd quite often come on a lonely grave, a grave out there, and people would say, who's there? I say, I don't know. And Yvonne used to say to me, well, we should know, we need to find out about this. So we started recording where they were and trying to find out about them. That developed, and Yvonne really got into it, and she worked hard on it. She'll probably tell you about this anyway. Got access to various places, and it just developed, and it just grew and grew. Yeah, this happened probably around about 1979, I think. We started in tourism about 1975, and I think Yvonne, it was around about the time that bicentenary came out, West Australia. People becoming more aware of family history and history in general. And really what Yvonne wanted to do was to record the graves, but she wanted to know more about the people and what was in them. She used to spend a huge amount of research and time working that out, which was been very beneficial to many organisations and people. There's a lot of people who have based a lot of research on what she's found out about people in these places.
The word freelance is used. Is that post your business? Did you then work as an individual rather than running a large company? Is that the explanation?
Yes. What happened was, about the last 2 years before we sold out, we'd just become so busy. It'd become too much with the family and trying to run that, because I could never say no. And if someone came up with an interest, if there's an interesting group or something, I would say yes. So virtually, for most of the year, for the last 2 years, we had so much work. I would come home and I'd only be home 1 or 2 days. Yvonne would have everything ready. She always used to have everything ready. She was absolutely marvellous. She used to have provisions for the next trip. She'd have an itinerary all worked out. So I'd come home, but I'd spend most of my time doing maintenance on the vehicles, getting that ready and getting everything cleaned up, and then I'd be off again. And this was becoming too much for us. We thought that we needed someone to come in with us, but it's very hands-on. We always wanted to be with the people. We didn't want to be sitting in an office or anything like that. So we thought we might try and get a partner in. We tried for a partner, but that didn't work out. And then we came to the decision, well, we've either got to sell or do something, or we've got to drastically reduce everything, which we didn't really want to do. So we made the decision to sell, and we had a state agent or an agent. We put a price on our business, what we wanted. We put on probably a higher price than what we thought would go, and it was my hope that it would be many, many months before anyone would bite at it and take it on. It was fairly specialised sort of a business. Within 2 hours of it being advertised, we had a buyer with cash. Within 2 days, there was another one, if the other one didn't take off, and by the end of the week, there was another one. There was 3 of them with cash that wanted to take it on. So that came as a bit of a shock and everything. So I said to the first one, I'd be quite happy to, as long as we didn't have the responsibility of the business, I'd be happy to work out for the first year, and if he wanted any trips done, that would be fine without the responsibility, because Yvonne having to be on hand all the time to look after the telephone, she's doing all the bookwork and everything. If we didn't have that responsibility, we thought, well, that wouldn't be too bad. So we did that, did various trips, and then we just did freelance. We did overseas trips, just when we wanted to do one. If it looked interesting, well, we'd take it on. And it's like used to do lecturing jobs on small ships and boats, Kimberley coast, and going from New Zealand across to the east coast, and as a tour guide lecturer.
You mentioned, I think, before we started recording, a group of Americans you took, and it was particularly enjoyable. Can you remind me of that one again?
Around about 1990, we first started doing coastal trips up along the Kimberley coast, natural history games. We were the first ones to do this. There were no boats available up there at all. When we first started, we had to get crayfishing boats that had charter licences from down south here at either Geraldton or Jurien. And when they first started up after the America's Cup, there was a couple of big boats came in. There was the Kimberley Explorer that failed. But as a result of publicity that had been given in America by the group that had that, there was another firm, Lindblad Tour Company. They decided that they would charter a boat from the east coast to come around and take tours because they liked the look of the operation. And they asked me if I would be one of the guys for this particular group. It was a history-based group, and I did that. I liked them, they liked us, and every other time they came, we had arrangements where I would do the trip for quite a few years.
Of course, the Americans were looking at a totally different ecology from their own Northern Hemisphere country, weren't they? Were they very curious about the difference between their own continent and ours?
Yes. It was quite a bit of difference there, and of course the Kimberley coast is a fantastic coast. It's got beautiful colours up there and very rugged, and some of the bays, the high rise and fallen tides, and all the wildlife that you have up through the Kimberley coast was very attractive to them. It's a remote area. I mean, it's probably the last great wilderness that we have up there, and it's still very untouched in many ways, and they liked it, and they used to keep coming back.
You've won a lot of awards in your time. Which are the ones that you value most?
We're the recipient of the Golden Guide Award in 2000, which is the top guiding award in this state. That was quite good. We were given a Premier's Award for Legends of the hospitality and tourism industry. Can't remember what year that was. And we also received, or both of us received, an OAM for our work with nature-based tourism about 2009.
Reflecting on your life as a country kid in Margaret River, did you ever imagine the kind of life you had in the end?
We've had an incredible life. We've met incredible people, been to amazing places, and we've loved every minute of it.
It seems like a path where you occasionally change the direction of the path, but you were moving somehow in the same sense all the time, weren't you?
Yes, we did change a little bit. Well, for example, we used to have a bit of a dead spot in summertime, and we were approached by a international school in Singapore. It's an American school. They have international schools all over the world for expatriates, Americans and other people working there. And they approached us to see whether we would take a tour for their kids in summertime, coinciding with the Chinese New Year. And the idea of doing a tour was to put them in a bus and just take them around and show them places, which wasn't our idea. And I'd been very involved before this with some of the TAFE programs for unemployed youth, where they were taken out into the bush, sense of place and everything, and put to give them a sense of worth in many cases by doing things that were challenging. And we thought, well, if they're going to have teenagers come to us, there'd be nothing worse for teenagers than sitting in a bus and just being driven around to show places around a city. So we said to them, well, how about if we take them and show them the countryside, but they work to do it. They canoe and they abseil and they do all other sort of things which we used to do with these other groups. And they were a little bit tentative about it for a little while, but anyway they said, well, we'll give it a try. So on the first year they came out, they were just so wrapped in what we did for them. We took the kids out. We stayed for a couple of days on a farm at Osmington in Margaret River as a base. They helped milk cows and did other things, marroned and everything. We took them horse riding up through the forest in Pemberton, and we canoed down the Blackwood River from Sue's Road down to Warner Glen. And it became so popular. The first group were the first year high school students, and this school had a policy of, during this time, it was 8 days, 10 days, everyone in the school had to go on some sort of adventure somewhere in the world, Southeast Asia mainly. And the older ones took precedence. So from the first trip, the word got back, and we had all the leaving school kids, they all came down, and they used to have a marvellous time. And that developed into quite a large number of people. We had them split into groups of 20. We ended up having 3 groups. There was 60 kids. I used to supply 2 of my staff to take them down and everything, and the school used to supply 2 of their staff, 2 of their teachers used to come, and we do the same things, but we do them at different times. And it developed afterwards to, they were wanting to do further afield, and we started off by taking groups to Tasmania. We used to do the walk from Cradle Mountain down to Lake St Clair and other places up in the Great Barrier Reef out in the Whitsunday Island. So it was quite a success, and the company is still doing these trips for them after all these years. I think the first trip we did was about 1983 or 4, I think. So they're still coming to the company, which is still going.
I think you've changed a few lives doing that.
Well, I know we have, and on some of our trips there's been a number of occasions where there's been happy occasions where single men and women have married. There's all sorts of things, and I know it's been pretty successful because we had so many repeats. We had one woman, she came 47 times with us on 47 trips to various places over the years, and we've had many of them when we had the company that had done over 30 trips with us. And we have one lovely lady, old Kath, who came with us until she couldn't do much, but she used to come just for the trip, but she did 25 trips with us over the years. So I did want to see Mary, the one that did 47 trips. I would have liked to have done the 50 for her, but she ended up, she used to come every year for a couple of trips from the eastern states just to do the trips, but she ended up passing away before she could do that.
Kevin, thank you very much for sharing those experiences.